Imagine spending nearly 40 years doing everything the right way. Every renewal submitted on time, every rule followed, every firearm stored legally. Never a criminal charge, never a warning, never a problem. Then one day, over a cup of coffee, someone tells you that the firearm you've owned for decades may no longer be legal. Not because you broke a law, not because you missed a renewal, but because the rules changed and nobody bothered to explain what those changes actually mean. That's exactly what happened to a retired Alberta tradesman named Harold. At 74 years old, Harold believed he understood the system. He had been a licensed firearms owner for most of his adult life. He had followed every regulation, completed every requirement, and never once given authorities a reason to question his responsibility. Then a phone call from his son changed everything. "Dad, I think the rules changed." Those 5 words were enough to create days of anxiety. His son wasn't trying to scare him. He genuinely believed he was helping. He had seen headlines about new firearms regulations, new restrictions, new classifications, new requirements. The news made it sound as though everything was changing. It sounded as though longtime firearm owners might suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of the law. For 3 days, Harold barely slept. He sat at his kitchen table wondering if decades of responsible ownership suddenly meant nothing. He wondered whether he had missed some government notice. He wondered if he would be forced to surrender property he had legally owned for years. Most importantly, he wondered if he could accidentally become non-compliant without even realizing it. And here's the frightening part. Harold was not confused because the law was unclear. Harold was confused because the information reaching him was incomplete. When he finally began researching the regulations for himself, he discovered something that completely changed his understanding of the situation. The rules he feared most either didn't apply to him at all or contained protections specifically designed for people in his exact position. In fact, many of the safeguards protecting longtime licensed firearm owners were buried deep inside regulatory language that never made the evening news. That's the problem facing thousands of Canadian seniors right now. Every time a firearms regulation changes, the headlines focus on what has been restricted, prohibited, updated, or expanded. That's what gets attention. That's what generates clicks. That's what dominates the conversation. But almost nobody talks about the exemptions. Almost nobody talks about grandfathered protections. Almost nobody talks about the provisions specifically written to protect people who have been following the law for decades. And because of that, many seniors are making decisions based on fear rather than facts. Think about it for a moment. Who is most likely to voluntarily give something up because they're worried about accidentally violating a rule? Is it the 30-year-old who spends hours arguing online about firearms legislation? Or is it the 70-year-old retiree who simply wants to stay compliant and avoid trouble? The answer is obvious. Older Canadians tend to respect the law deeply. They don't want conflict. They don't want uncertainty. If they hear something might no longer be permitted, many assume the safest option is to give it up. And that is exactly why misinformation becomes so dangerous. Because people aren't losing rights due to enforcement. They're losing them because they're surrendering them voluntarily after hearing incomplete information. That brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of Canada's firearms framework: the difference between a new applicant and a long-term licensed owner. These two groups are often treated very differently under the law, yet news coverage frequently talks about them as if they're identical. They're not. A person who has maintained a valid firearms license for years without interruption occupies a very different legal position than someone entering the system for the first time. Legislators understand this. Courts understand this. Regulators understand this. The problem is that ordinary Canadians often don't understand it because nobody explains it clearly. Whenever major regulatory changes are introduced, lawmakers must consider how those changes affect people who have already been complying with previous laws. Applying entirely new burdens to long-standing lawful owners can create serious legal challenges. That's why protections and transitional provisions often exist. But here's the catch. Those protections don't help if nobody knows they exist. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. Thousands of responsible firearm owners are hearing fragments of information from social media, news broadcasts, neighbors, and even family members. One person says something changed. Another person says a firearm is now prohibited. Someone else claims a new requirement applies to everyone. Before long, confusion spreads faster than facts. People begin making life-changing decisions based on rumors rather than reality. What makes this especially concerning for seniors is that many of them have invested decades into remaining compliant. They have maintained records, renewed licenses, completed requirements, and followed every instruction placed in front of them. Yet despite all that effort, many now find themselves wondering whether they still understand the rules. The answer, in many cases, is simpler than they think. The first thing every senior firearm owner needs to understand is this: never assume a headline tells the whole story. Headlines are designed to attract attention. The law is designed to define obligations. Those are two completely different things. A regulation that sounds sweeping in a headline may contain multiple exceptions, transitional provisions, grandfathering clauses, or accommodation mechanisms that dramatically change how it applies in the real world. Unfortunately, most people never read that far. They see the headline, assume the worst, and stop there. That is exactly how fear replaces facts. And when fear takes over, people begin surrendering rights they may still legally possess. That's why today's conversation matters so much. Because before anyone makes a decision about their firearms, before anyone considers surrendering property, before anyone assumes they are no longer compliant, they owe it to themselves to understand the complete picture. Not the television version, not the social media version, not the rumor passed around at the coffee shop. The complete picture. And as you're about to see, that picture looks very different than most Canadians have been led to believe. Now, before we get into the specific protections that many longtime firearm owners don't realize they have, I want you to think about something. Imagine two Canadians. Both own firearms legally. Both have clean records. Both have followed every regulation for years. Yet when a new law is announced, one of them remains calm, while the other immediately starts wondering if they need to sell, surrender, or dispose of property they've owned for decades. The difference between those two people isn't intelligence. It isn't education. It isn't experience. It's information. One person understands how regulations are actually implemented. The other only knows what they heard in a headline. And that's exactly where so much confusion begins. The average person hears the words "new firearms restrictions" and assumes the government is talking about every firearm owner in Canada. But regulations are rarely that simple. In reality, lawmakers often divide people into categories. New applicants may face one set of requirements. Existing license holders may face another. Certain classifications of firearms may be affected while others are not. Some provisions take effect immediately, while others include transition periods that can last years. The details matter. In fact, the details often matter more than the headline itself. Unfortunately, most people never see those details. What they see are alarming news reports. They hear politicians arguing on television. They read social media posts written by people who have only half the information. Before long, uncertainty starts spreading through entire communities. One person tells a neighbor they heard licenses are changing. That neighbor tells someone else that firearms might need to be surrendered. By the time the story reaches a senior sitting at home watching the evening news, it barely resembles the actual regulation anymore. That is why so many Canadian seniors are finding themselves worried today. Not because they have done anything wrong, not because authorities are knocking on their doors, but because nobody has taken the time to explain where they actually stand under the law. The first protection that many longtime firearm owners fail to recognize is something incredibly important. Experience matters. Longevity matters. A person who has maintained a valid firearms license continuously for decades occupies a very different position than someone entering the licensing system for the first time. Think about it from a practical perspective. If you've demonstrated responsibility year after year, completed renewals on time, maintained compliance, and stayed within the law for decades, regulators already have an established history showing exactly who you are. That history matters. In many areas of law, governments must carefully balance new regulations against the rights and expectations of people who were already complying with existing rules. Courts have repeatedly recognized that governments cannot simply pretend history doesn't exist. Longtime lawful owners often receive considerations, transitional measures, or specific protections because they entered the system under a different set of expectations. This isn't special treatment, it's recognition of reality. And that's something many seniors never hear. Instead, they hear a simplified version that makes it sound as though everyone is suddenly subject to exactly the same obligations overnight. That simply isn't how regulatory systems usually work. The second issue that deserves far more attention involves physical limitations that often come with age. Let's be honest, a person who is 75 years old may not have the same mobility, strength, hearing, or endurance they had at 45. Arthritis becomes common. Joint replacements become common. Balance issues become common. Vision changes become common. These realities affect millions of Canadians every year. Yet many seniors assume that if a training requirement, certification process, or administrative procedure becomes physically difficult, they have no choice but to give up. That assumption can be devastating, because the law often provides mechanisms specifically designed to prevent people from losing rights solely because of age-related limitations. Think about that for a moment. Canada has built entire legal frameworks around the concept of reasonable accommodation. The idea is straightforward. If a person has a legitimate limitation that creates barriers, the solution is not automatically to exclude them. The solution is to determine whether there is a reasonable way to achieve the same objective without creating an unfair burden. Yet many seniors never even explore these options. They simply assume that if a process looks difficult, their rights disappear. Nothing could be further from the truth. The real tragedy is that countless people give up before they ever ask the question. And that's exactly what almost happened to Harold. Had he relied solely on what he heard from others, he might have voluntarily surrendered something he was fully entitled to keep. He might have spent years believing the law had turned against him when, in reality, the law contained protections specifically designed for people in his situation. That's why knowledge is so powerful, because once you understand how these systems actually work, fear starts to disappear. The rumors lose their power, the confusion begins to clear, and suddenly, decisions that once seemed overwhelming become much easier to navigate. The next protection may be the most important one of all because it involves something thousands of Canadian firearm owners have heard about, but very few truly understand: grandfathering. This single concept has caused more confusion, more panic, and more unnecessary surrender of legally owned property than almost any other aspect of firearms regulation. In fact, if there's one topic that deserves your complete attention today, it's this one. Because understanding how grandfathering works could completely change the way you view your own situation.